The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Nigan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Nigan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
All right, everybody, here we are for another podcast, and it's a very special post-election podcast because sitting here with us in the Manitoba Legislature, in the Premier's office, is now Premier Wab Kinew, well known by everybody at this point, but is a first of many, and it's a real honor to have you here.
Well, it's nice to be talking to you on the podcast after having been sworn in, rather than talking about, maybe someday, or, we'll do that in the future. But
I think the idea, you're now the first 3-time guest of the podcast. And I don't know, I wouldn't what Bull Durham says, you don't mess with a streak. So I think that every 6 weeks we ought to have you on the podcast, and that'll just ensure success through the first. I have to say, first off, I was very excited for about 15 minutes on election night because I thought that at 41, you were going to become the youngest premier in Canadian history. For about 15 minutes, I really thought it.
No, I'm sure Ed Schreier was younger.
No, Brian Alexander Gallant in 1983 was 32 years old when he was sworn in as Premier of New Brunswick. So I guess that, being 9 years younger, the first question is what took you so long?
Yeah. Well, when I was running for leadership, because you got to work the phones and sell memberships and get support, one of the longtime New Democrats I called, and, at the time I would have been, I guess, in my early 30s, who said, you're a lot older than Schreier was, but I'll give you a chance.
Oh, man. Do you find that people bring up your age a lot? I mean, you're not the youngest maybe, but by most standards, you're still pretty young.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that, and I would like you to say that in front of my teenage sons and their friends who kind of groan when I try and talk, football or pop culture with them. But on a more serious level, it does come up from time to time, but it's come up in a positive way, if I could say that. I was speaking to somebody from the United States, and they said, well, maybe it's good to have younger folks in office. I'm not saying I'm young, but maybe just relative to some office holders south of the border. There's
not mentioning any names.
Mentioning any names whatsoever.
So we're a few days out now about the swearing-in ceremony at the Leaf. Mm-hmm. I have to make a comment in that my daughter said that you made a dad joke at that, turning over a leaf in Manitoba. Anyways,
I had a worse dad joke lined up, which was the hard work of the raking up the leaves that we're all doing right now. So I spared you the worst, I guess.
No, seriously, you're premier now. You can make whatever jokes you want, right? If you don't, what's the use of having this job if you need to be careful about the jokes you tell?
Well, it will definitely stick to the dad jokes that we can all agree are not done.
Yeah.
So, besides the dad jokes, arguably, I haven't attended tons of cabinet swearing-in ceremonies. I haven't been to, normally these are, I think Dan wrote a column about this. These are rather sort of official ceremonies that tend to take place in the legislature. As you talked about in your speech, every Indigenous nation was recognized. That, of course, all the different other nations that are a part of Manitoba are all a big part of that, as well as members of the LGBTQ community, trans community. Everybody seemed to be talked about in that ceremony. So much about this election campaign was about difference, and you, as you talked about unity. How do you think many Manitobans who perhaps didn't vote, or maybe were looking at a different message, we're talking about 200,000 voters who voted for another message. How do you think they took that ceremony?
Well, I think there's been a lot of optimism that I've heard from people since the election and since the swearing in So I think it's been a very interesting time. And what that means is, in addition to all the normal high expectations of a change in government, it also means there's this additional expectation that a lot of people are feeling good in Manitoba right now, and now we have to deliver on that optimism and on that sense of hope. And just on the swearing-in ceremony itself, it typically is, I would say there's stuff that we did like other governments, and there's stuff that we did that was new this time around. So in terms of the continuity side of things, when government changes, there typically is a bigger deal. Like I think Mr. Dewey did Pantages Playhouse as like a big public swearing-in production, if you will. Mr. Pallister did the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, which at that time, and still is, like a very new showpiece for our city. But one of the reasons why we wanted to do the Leaf was just like, that's the new building in town that's speaking to the future of our city and the future of our province. And so we wanted to do that. So in some ways, I think there is consistency with the previous changes in government and their swearing in. And then the stuff that maybe we chose to lean into more was around recognizing the Indigenous nations, and was talking about all communities and different walks of life being represented there. And that is consistent with what we talked about during the campaign. And now we had a moment to celebrate, and now it's up to us to administer the government in Manitoba in a way that everybody recognizes themselves in our decisions and feels like they have a part of the things we do in healthcare or affordability or the other public policy areas.
One of the really interesting things that I've had to deal with, and over the past couple days or so, is a lot of people turn to me and ask, like, why is he wearing a headdress? Like, why is a headdress so important? And so I've had to kind of do this explanation to people that a headdress is about leadership. It's not about a chief of a community always. And that the reason that we use feathers in the headdress is to ask our leaders to see the highest in the sky, to not see difference, and to talk about that message. This is where we kind of disclose, as journalists, as you've got to disclose your subjectivity, or that you're. I mean, my father was a part of the ceremony, so
he was on stage.
He was on stage.
Your dad was on stage,
and
he administered the oath, right?
Yeah.
He was also kind of grooving to the Norman dancers.
Yeah,
it was like in his own. He was doing one of these, which is, for listeners, is rhythmic thumbs up. But yeah, he had to be the happiest guy in the whole room. And Chief, I think you should have Chief as MC, Kevin Chief, as MC of every government event.
He was pretty good. And, obviously he had a lot of, some jokes and levity and energy, but he actually said some stuff that I thought was quite, profound as well, which one of them that, Kevin Chief said was, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not going to capture the same magic that he had, but that Indigenous cultures can't just be learned about through reading or hearing about it. You really have to experience it. And so that's why having the jigging, the singing, the ceremonial, the ritual part of it was really important, because we had business leaders there, municipal leaders, people from different walks of life in our province, and then they were all able to participate in this shared experience.
So one of the things I wrote about was the fact that you guys managed to put the ceremony back in the ceremony. And I've been blessed as a journalist to be present at Indigenous ceremonies in a whole bunch of different contexts, including like some very tragic contexts. Plane crash in northwestern Ontario. I spent like 4 days on a remote reserve and got to see how the community responded to, 8 non-Indigenous people who died on the reserve. And I think that, just from my perspective, adding a spiritual element to that ceremony was so cool and profound. And I'm just wondering, for those people, maybe even in your own government, who haven't been to ceremony, how did they react? Did they understand what differentiates a swearing-in ceremony from what you did last week or earlier this week?
I think everyone could see that it was a ceremony in the broad sense of the word that you're using it. And I think everyone on our team felt very, very positive and felt it was a really meaningful experience. And I hope that all Manitobans felt the same way about it. And really, one of the things that we wanted to do is to just showcase not just the diversity, but also the complexity and the nuance of the different Indigenous nations in Manitoba. So we had traditional components like the Dakota Hotain singers, and we're using the sacred pipe, and we had that. We had the kuluk from the Inuit, but then we also had Christian prayers that were part of it, the Lord's Prayer, because that's what a lot of Inuit and a lot of Cree communities, that's how they practice their culture. And so really we just wanted it to be inclusive and to be broadly representative. Of course, we can't necessarily highlight every single nuance, but hopefully we did convey the bigger picture reality that there is nuance and there is diversity, and that inclusion means making space for all of that.
So the ceremony's over now. You're in the office, really, beautiful office. I can see we've got the buffalo skull over there that you've brought into the office from the Sundance, and now it's the business of governing. Here we are, a couple days in. This whole place is buzzing. In fact, when we came in the front door, there's an energy here that's very electric. From the moment you walk in, there's a real sense of a lot of busyness. Of course, it's the change in government and so on. When the Conservatives came in 2016, the very first thing they did was to do an audit and to analyze what they had perhaps thought about as kind of maybe deficiencies, but also at the worst end of that, maybe some instances of mismanagement of money. Are you planning any kind of analysis or any kind of audit to look at the maybe the past little while or maybe even longer while at the Conservatives? And I'm thinking about this consistently because, when I got home from traveling, there was a check in my mailbox from the province for property tax rebate that I didn't expect coming. And maybe it was because I missed the dates or the deadlines or what happened. But certainly I think there certainly might be some questions that you may have coming into the office of what have the Conservatives done in the past few months.
Yeah, we are. We're going through that process right now of reviewing what the outgoing government was up to. I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone that there is a lot more going on in the healthcare system that you're going to find out about in the weeks to come, just to show what a mess there is in terms of the administrative side of healthcare and really how challenging things are in terms of delivering healthcare services to people. You saw a story overnight, and you're going to continue to see more stories about ERs and things like that. But what the people of Manitoba may not be as familiar with is that there's also a financial mess left by the PCs on their way out the door. They overextended themselves pretty dramatically in trying to win back support in an election year. And in the coming weeks and months, I think we're going to, share that with people so that they can understand that, the idea that PCs are fiscally responsible simply just is not true, at least not in Manitoba anymore. And so there is going to be, I guess, a review process, if you will, because a lot of the things that the PCs claimed, even before the blackout period, but definitely during the election, when it comes to provincial finances, simply had no bearing in reality. So we're going to have to correct that.
So a couple of specific issues that are kind of hanging in the air for us. It's not to say that they're a priority for the government.
Right.
One is the pandemic response, and one is the completely unsatisfactory and somewhat confusing end to the drama over the Winnipeg Police Headquarters construction.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I'll deal with the first one first. Mm-hmm. Auditors General in a couple of provinces have already done exhaustive analyses of the provincial pandemic response. In Ontario in particular, former Manitoba OAG working there did a review. Do you anticipate either working with the Auditor General or in some other forum to take a look at how the government responded to the pandemic, what it did wrong, what perhaps it did right, but also I think what everybody wants to know is how much political influence there was over decisions that should have been made really more by experts in public health?
Well, yes, and we are committed to an inquiry on the pandemic, but I really want to focus on the future.
Yep.
Like, rather than assigning blame and pointing the finger, I really wanted to focus more on the recommendations of what do we do for a future public health crisis or a future natural disaster, some other big challenge that befalls us in Manitoba. The Auditor General is a good point. They've already looked into some aspects of the pandemic response. So I think as we get into our administration here, we will be launching an inquiry into the pandemic. But like I said, less about assigning blame and more so about bringing experts together to say what went right, what went wrong, what can we do better next time, and really focus it on the future. And I think part of that is to just match how Manitobans feel, which is I don't think Manitobans want to continue relitigating the past 3 years, but at the same time, it was such a huge challenge, such a traumatic experience in many ways that I think the only responsible thing to do is to do a bit of an organizational review and a bit of a fact-finding exercise in terms of how can we improve things for the future.
Respecting your comments about not relitigating, do you believe, though, the relationships and interactions between political leaders and leaders of the public health system and how decisions were made, that's at the very least, that's one of the issues that we need to cover off?
Well, I do, and this came up during the pandemic, was that notwithstanding whatever public comments were made, the actual structure is that the public health officials provide advice, and then the elected officials are the ones who actually issue the directive or who implement the policy. And I do think that there is room to ask this panel of experts, is that the right structure? Or should the public health folks have the final say? Which, if you look at different jurisdictions, there are those two approaches and variations on them out there. But I do think that one of the other related issues, and I have heard this from folks working in the healthcare system, was just also like the culture of reprisal, or like the top-down heaviness that prevented either local solutions from being brought forward to some of the challenges during the pandemic, or just the ability for people to speak freely. Like, when you think back to some of the most challenging periods, like Maples, that stuff came out anonymously and without names attached and not through formal government channels. And yet it was absolutely critical to the public interest for people to find out about those things. So I do think that that's one of the areas where we need to look at. And again, my partisan heart might very much like to point fingers through this exercise. I think the broader responsibility is to the people of Manitoba, and to focus it more on the future of this clearly outlines some challenges around disclosure and whistleblowing and the fear of reprisal. How can we address those things and make sure that we fix them going forward, not least of all so that we can improve the way the healthcare system works and empower the people who work within it?
Blue ribbon panel, consultant, or formal commission of inquiry, do you have a preferred path for something like this?
I think at this point, formal commission of inquiry with the terms of reference that we would establish that would be, again, much more focused on the future and bringing back recommendations for improving things.
And public hearings?
Well, I think that is probably the way we would go. But again, we need to get some legal advice in terms of what are all the considerations there. Because the other thing is we want people to be able to participate freely without, again, that fear of, having blame assigned to them.
When I brought it up before, I'm going to acknowledge that the police headquarters and all of the legal wrangling, that's probably something that was just outside of the reach of your radar for things that you need to take care of. But do you think in some form we need to resolve a situation where the Provincial Crown Service decided not to lay charges on a case where there has been such a devastating civil verdicts delivered? And I think the public is confused about where things appear to lie, especially it appears that the police wanted to lay charges, the Crown had it, didn't, but then when we saw the evidence through the civil proceedings, it was quite a story. And I don't know that you've probably had time to consider that completely, but where do we start with something like that?
Well, I think we are committed to an inquiry there as well. And part of it is, even though I'm a close observer and had a front row seat to a lot of the, follow-up on this issue, that I don't know the answer to many of the factual questions. that you're raising there. And I do think it is in the public interest for us to figure out what happened here, in large part because while there might be some measure of accountability coming through the civil processes, that I do think there is that responsibility to figure out, how do we avoid having a situation like this with so many unanswered questions in the future.
In your first speech as Premier, I wrote about it today. You probably hadn't had time to read the column that I wrote today, but
I read it.
But, okay. Well,
You don't have to flatter him, it's if you're not if you're going to get
columns too.
Oh, okay. Well, please carry on.
I point out that by making yourself the Minister of Indigenous Reconciliation alongside as the Premier, first time in history this has ever occurred, but and the reason rightly so, or is that just the government's not set up, provincial governments aren't set up to have direct relationship with First Nations or frankly Métis. And so as a result, there's been a lot of, we'll call it a gap in communication or a gap in relationship. You, by saying you're going to recognize First Nations governments, and if we just take Manitoba, you said in your speech, in all North America, which is pretty big and lofty, but we've got 63 First Nations in Manitoba. We've got the Manitoba Métis Federation. You said in the speech that as intergovernmental minister, you're going to recognize them as governments. What does that entail? That's a pretty big statement because, as I point out, that BC's been going to try to do this over a long period of time to recognize Indigenous rights or Indigenous people's right to govern themselves and others in their traditional territories. What does that really mean? And does it mean that First Nations can begin the process of having their decisions recognized by police, the courts, child welfare agencies, the healthcare system?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about relationship building and ensuring that there's the communication of respect and a real engagement on a substantive level when issues arise. So as Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, if something came up with the state of North Dakota, the expectation would be that I would lead the response as a Premier. If something came up with the federal government, the expectation is that I would call the Prime Minister, for lack of a better term. And so part of what I'm indicating here is when an issue arises with the Manitoba Métis Federation or with the First Nations government, that I will lead the response. But then, of course, we're going to have other ministers who are empowered and the civil service who's empowered to follow up on that. As we started to talk about this project before it was announced publicly, one of the messages we heard from the civil service was this would really help us. Because up till now, the civil service has often wondered, who am I supposed to engage with on a specific project? Like, let's say there's a resource project. Am I supposed to engage with a specific First Nation? Am I supposed to engage with SCO, with MKO, with the Manitoba Métis Federation, with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs? And so I think part of what the civil service will be able to improve in terms of the more rubber meets the road question that you're kind of posing here is that going forward, I think there's going to be greater clarity across different departments, whether that's in economic development, investment, trade, and natural resources, or whether that's municipal. There's going to be a greater path forward there. But in terms of the delivery of services, I would think that this is a value proposition for everyone in Manitoba. I think that things will be better off for everybody in the province. And here's one specific example. We have an argument being brought forward from the civil service in healthcare saying right now the Northern Health Region is spending $20 million on a specific type of patient transportation that we think if you deliver health services in First Nations, you would be able to reduce the spending on. And there is a precedent for delivery of some health services on First Nations. There's a dialysis unit in Garden Hill as one example. But I'm just laying this out where I think there is opportunity for us in the future to make a better functioning healthcare system for everybody in Manitoba if we just take some common sense steps to say we're going to deliver services closer to home rather than to spend the money on transporting people far away and then all the other attendant issues around people being separated from family supports and cultural supports. So I do think that as we go forward with this project, it is about reconciliation very much, but it is also, I think, about delivering a more effective government in a way that would benefit everyone in the province, whether they're Indigenous or not.
That's also, to be clear, that is the legal principle of Jordan's principle, which is that young youth, for example, and Joyce's principle, Joyce Eschquan's principle, Joyce principle is that First Nations should not be discriminated against simply because they live in a First Nation or that they are First Nations. And that Jordan's principle is that children should not be discriminated against just because they live on a First Nation. So, you're basically adopting and accepting those two premises.
Yeah, as a philosophical framework. And now the question is, what does that mean in reality? And I think the thing that's going to guide us is we have this big picture project of improving healthcare for everybody, among many other big priorities that we're being tasked with. So how, as part of an improvement for healthcare for the average person in South Winnipeg or the average person in Souris, how do we make the delivery of healthcare services more efficient for somebody living on a First Nation so that we again have the level of appropriate resources to deliver to other people in the province of Manitoba?
So just following up on that, though, I personally have visited 3 First Nations and had conversations about their right to issue fishing licenses, hunting licenses, their ability to levy fines, in a civil context. Nigan and I were talking about the possibility of speeding tickets and highway traffic enforcement and that kind of thing. In many ways, that's probably not even the most important expression of a recognition of First Nations as a separate level of government. And yet they are basic functions that right now the provincial government or the federal government is doing for. And that doing for instead of doing by is a big issue when it comes to recognition. Do you see some evolution of that happening where it says more of these administrative and legal responsibilities gets transferred?
Yeah, I do. And I would think that it probably comes up first in areas around public safety, because I've heard from some leaders from Northern First Nations where they want help with the airports, which are under provincial jurisdiction, and issues of toxic drugs and other things coming into their communities. And then a broader question across the province, including in southern communities where people are worried about public safety. And there is a responsibility of the province to support law enforcement through all the various levels, including the RCMP, including local police forces, but also to work with the Manitoba First Nations police, right? So I think that that's probably going to be one of the first areas where these sorts of questions get sorted through. But I think the way to sort through them is to have that honest and open dialogue with what I'm clearly articulating now are the First Nations and Métis governments, and our government, and where necessary, provincial and municipal governments, so that we can chart a path forward. The commitment is there. Now the question is around resources, around implementation, and around questions of enforcement.
The other big announcement, other than healthcare, is the creation of a new ministry.
Right.
So homelessness, addiction. I'm probably going to get the order wrong here. Homelessness, addictions, and housing, yeah. And under Minister Smith. So, undoubtedly, Minister Smith has direct experience. Having a member of her family in murder missing Indigenous women and girls, heading up a project like Drag the Red. How monumental is that ministry? And as you said, bringing all of these different stakeholders into one ministry almost seems, as someone who works in frontline poverty and have done so for 30 years, when just walking through North Point Douglas, walking through Main Street, the fact that even social agencies, who some of them are Christian, some of them are First Nation, Indigenous run, some of them are just interested communities in certain neighborhoods of the city that are volunteering. Even just getting them to agree alone on the solutions is difficult enough. How do you bring all of these different stakeholders who for years have worked in silos to try to, I think Minister Smith has got a monumental task.
Yeah, I think it is by no means going to be an easy project, but it's one that our whole team is really committed to, and we've asked Minister Smith to lead that project. But what I would say is, like, where have we seen success locally and where have we seen success in other areas? It's typically been when people have a barrier-free approach and they have no concern with turf wars, and there's not a concern with, ideological constraints, if we could say things like that. Where we've seen success locally, I would say, is Bear Clan, Mama Bear Clan, Sabe Peace Walkers. People who just go out and they see somebody who's thirsty, they give them a bottle of water, see somebody who's hungry, they give them a sandwich, and they just try and work from there. And perhaps maybe tie people into other services as appropriate. When we look at other cities, whether it's Houston, Lethbridge, other communities out there who are dealing with people without shelter, or they're dealing with addictions, it has been working across government, business, nonprofits to have a barrier-free approach and to ensure that everyone participating has a shared commitment. And so I think the first step that we announced this week, and I think it's crucial, not just operationally for our government, but also because of the message that it telegraphs to the broader community, is we're bringing everything together under one roof, from the housing to the wraparound supports, the addictions programming, the mental health initiatives that are needed here, so that we can get people off the street and into housing, and then provide the wraparounds for them while they're there. And now that we've done this at the government level, it's going to be our expectation that we're going to work together with everyone else out there for the same goal, and to have a similar approach.
I mean, I'm very interested to see the research that comes out of, we're still at the new stage of the development of Thunderbird House, and seeing the kind of ways that project is or is not working. I'm interested to see what the research is, but I know that it's hard to make a commitment this early in your premiership, but you've in the past said quite directly that you support safe injection sites, or at least the movement towards safe injection, similar to what we might see in Thunder Bay and something like that. Is that your plan? Is it your plan to move towards safe injection sites?
Yeah, I use the term supervised consumption site, just to, I guess, maybe try to describe accurately what's taking place there, which is medical and expert supervision of people who are consuming substances. And, I do think that has to be part of a harm reduction, expert-driven response to the addictions crisis. But really, the hope there is to ensure that when somebody walks through the door and they talk to the nurse who's there, that they're going to be able to access primary care and potentially find out if they're pregnant, or if they have an STBBI, or if they need some other form of medical attention. And by the way, can we talk about recovery? Can we talk about, addressing mental health needs, or, healing from childhood trauma, other things that are going on there. So I just want folks to understand that, yes, as we're committed to this thing, that the real goal is to start treating, and we've talked about this before on your podcast, is to start treating the addictions crisis as a healthcare crisis, and to use a health-driven response to it.
So I will say it doesn't really matter which political leader or which government, but my antenna start to twitch anytime I hear a politician promise to end or eliminate a problem, because having been involved in this gig way too long, I see these things always come back to haunt.
Yeah.
And hallway medicine is still, kind of hanging in the air in this province. That was the promise of the 1999 NDP led by Gary Doer. It was a key pledge in the NDP winning that election, and 17 years in government would suggest that, there was some measure of success in what they did in 99, but ending hallway medicine, still kind of hangs there. What we found out later on was that there's always going to be people, there need to be people at times within eyesight close to medical help, and where there may not be room in an ER. So eliminating hallway medicine really wasn't the goal. The goal was to stop people spending days and days and days in hallways. But it came out as end hallway medicine. So ending chronic homelessness. Okay. I want you to describe to me what that, like if you get a measure of success or complete success, what is that going to look like? Because, I think the idea that there will be no one living hard, that's hard to believe. What's your image? What's your definition of ending chronic homelessness?
Well, I think the word chronic is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. And basically, We're saying 6 weeks. And the expectation should be, once we've fully implemented this agenda and this program, that everyone in Manitoba should expect that if someone is on the streets for 6 weeks, by that time we will have found them, connected them with housing, and connected them with the other services that they need to get back on a more positive path. But I also want to say that the goal in us talking about it in this way is to be ambitious and to set a clear message to the people of Manitoba that we want to be held accountable on this. Because if we don't set an ambitious target, and most specifically, if we don't set a target, then everything on homelessness is always just going to be another 50 million, another 120 million. It's just going to be a continued government investment. But what is the actual difference that it's making for people in the community? And what is the difference that it's making for people who don't feel comfortable when they go downtown right now, or when they drive by a bus shelter on South Pembina? So really, it is ambitious. It is a big goal. It's going to be very difficult to reach, but I think it's important that we set a high bar so that Manitobans can actually hold us accountable and say, in the first instance, is homelessness getting better generally? But in the second, more specific instance, have they hit that target of 6 weeks? And, how well are they doing in terms of turning things around?
And then I guess to then assess the sustainability of it. Like, if you do get someone off the street, how long can they stay there?
Yeah.
Is there more to be done at that point?
It's really bad. You have encampments in part of the province where they've never existed before, outside the city of Winnipeg, in rural communities, on reserve, you have encampments. And this is part of a much larger social phenomena that has to do with addictions and the post-pandemic period, that has to do with intergenerational trauma, that has to do with the child welfare system. So in the immediate instance, and this is, hey, you know as well as I do, when the temperature drops another 10 degrees, this is going to be it's
a crisis thing.
It's going to be a very acute issue that our government is going to have a response to. And in, I guess, the more medium term, it's going to be more about what is the effective delivery of housing and wraparound services look like? And then in the longer term, we do have to grapple with those bigger intergenerational challenges of poverty and trauma and addictions that I'm talking about. So it is a major undertaking, but I do think we can move the needle on it, and we have to.
So mostly in the podcast today, we've dealt with all the easy questions. Those have been all the easy questions.
Reconciliation, homelessness, fixing healthcare.
Easy stuff. Low hanging fruit, as we call it in the biz. So I have a couple of questions that are inspired actually by my experience with covering other premiers.
Okay.
So Gary Filmon and Gary Dewar, they're lake guys. When they need to get away from it, that was their getaway. After that, we had a guy who needed to travel to another continent. Famously travel to another continent. Although, if you are harboring some form of holiday vacation property in another jurisdiction, this is the perfect environment. You're among friends here, so just go ahead and tell us. But no, if you needed to get away from Winnipeg, to rest, repair, relaxation, where would you go? Where have you gone? Where do you go?
Well, probably to the reserves that I come from in northwestern Ontario, or to Dauphin, which is where my wife used to live and practice medicine. So those are two places that we get to quite regularly. I'm going to go to Onigaming. Yeah, I think in just over a week's time, we're going to have a fish fry with the community just to kind of celebrate and give thanks to all the people that I grew up with there. And then Dauphin, it's just a place that we really like in the province, where my wife still has a lot of friends, and we have a lot of good, working relationships with people now through politics. So it's probably one of those two spots. And the Riding Mountain is not a bad place to be at the foot of the Riding Mountain, or to visit Clear Lake. So it's really
for
good.
Sure. Just in case your boys are listening to the podcast, you want to throw in one trip to Disney World or something like that, just so they have something to look forward to?
Yes. Well, I think we're going to spend Christmas in Manitoba, just to kind of take some time. But yeah, for sure, we'll find some time to get away.
I was with a group of, speaking of the boys, I was with a group of young people this morning, and I was telling them that I'm going to interview you and visit with you. And one of them cares a lot about the Jets and wanted me to ask you, are you concerned about the attendance? And I think that, the attendance is down, and we saw that over the years, the Jets left because of issues around attendance, also lots of other issues, business and the Canadian dollar and so on. But I was assigned to ask you that question.
I love the Winnipeg Jets. I love Adam Lowry being the captain of the team this season. I was very happy that they were able to sign Hellebuck and Scheifele to stay long term. And I'll take responsibility for my share of the attendance, because I haven't made it out to a game yet this year, even though we do share tickets with the in-laws. And so I'll definitely change that and start getting out to games as soon as I can. And I think it's really important for the Jets and the Bombers to be, healthy and thriving in the city. I think that's good for the social fabric. It's good for the economy. It's good for any number of things. So yeah, I share the hopes for a winning Jets season, as I'm sure this young person does. And I think we all do our part and cheer on the home team. I think that'll help.
I think, one of the best moments of the ceremony was when you were speaking directly to your family. And that's it's your job. It's their burden, to a certain extent.
Good way to put it.
Yeah. I've seen it, right? Like I've seen, really smart people in politics have to manage, people, in the federal system who have to spend all their time away from home.
Yeah.
Moving forward, on election night, maybe before the results started coming in or prior to election night, did you ever have this, be careful what you wish for moments? You've lived the life of a political leader now for 6 years.
Yeah.
So it's not like, I know that the operational tempo, as they like to say in the military, is going to pick up, but you know what the demands are.
Yeah.
But did you ever have that moment leading up where you went, oh, geez, what am I doing?
I think I'm really lucky that our family has a very clear-eyed view of it. And so, leading into the election, even though our kids, one is an adult and, the other's a teenager and the other one's in, the K-12 system, this is what they've known for as long as, they can pretty much remember. And prior to that, I was on TV. Not that I was, the really high-profile person at that time, but they're used to hearing my voice on the radio or just seeing the image in the media. So I don't, I never kind of play or underestimate the impact that it has on them. But I also feel like they've grown up with a lot of family support and community support so that they could succeed here in terms of this new reality. And then from election on forward, I think my wife actually said it best, which was, on Thanksgiving weekend, she just turned to me and she said, I feel like we're on the top of a roller coaster right now. And what's going to come in the next weeks is all the ups and downs and the banking turns and the corkscrew shape going around.
I would definitely get that done on a T-shirt for everybody for Christmas. That stocking stuffer, definitely. In my column, I drew a parallel to some of the commentary from Barack Obama in his autobiography, and he talked about coming to office, to the highest office in that land, carrying the expectations of a particular group of people, and that he calls them oversized expectations. Do you feel the weight of oversized expectations, particularly from Indigenous people? Do you worry that you're not going to be able to be all that they want you to be?
Well, this is what I signed up for, and so I feel a responsibility, is how I'd say it. And I had I've definitely had many interactions since the election with a lot of people, including on swearing-in day. But my first time leaving the city on an official visit was to go to Cross Lake. And while we were there, we were supposed to open help celebrate the opening of the new health center. But they insisted that we visit the schools. And these schools are way over capacity because of the young population in the community. And so they gathered all 1,000 kids outside of the elementary school, and then again at the high school. And just to see the optimism, the excitement, the fist bumps and the cheering and the selfies with the older kids at these schools, it just made it very clear. It was a clarifying experience where, I just thought to myself, this is what it's about. It's about for kids in this community. It's for kids in suburban Winnipeg. It's for young people in southern Manitoba, right across Manitoba. We have a huge responsibility to deliver. And so I think the only way you can respond is to try and stay humble, and then to just work as hard as you can to deliver on those expectations, because that's what the people of Manitoba deserve. Manitobans deserve to set a high bar and expect your public servants to reach it.
I have one story to add to that. And so we both have fathers who have come through a lot of trauma as Indigenous men. Mm-hmm. And so we don't hear the words, "I love you" very much, right? So I'm flying back. I was in Toronto. I missed the swearing in, but I knew it would be coming for this interview. My father told me he loved me that night. And I think large part because he was moved by the things that he had witnessed, right? That he had seen. And one of the great things is that I was able to tell my dad, because one of the things that for years, one of the hardest things has been just not having your dad around, and watching your father go to all these little towns in Manitoba, going to churches, going to hundreds of places across the province. And so one thing I told him is, I said, when he said that this was a moment of Manitoba's reconciliation, I think what he was saying is that Manitoba made a choice on this election, and that Manitoba has taken a long time to kind of come to grips with the understanding that we have deep relationships with each other as Canadians, as Indigenous peoples together. And one thing I said to my father was, much of that day was about those road trips he took, and much about, and I think your father too, certainly the travels that he took, with the great Tobasonaquit and the great vision that he gave to all of us. I was able to sort of come to a point of understanding with my father from that day. So I think that's something that I think is happening for a lot of us, and that it's not just about putting that on you, but also coming to an understanding of this moment historically, what it means for us as family members. And so I just want to say miigwech to that.
That really means a lot that you shared that, and I feel the emotion. And what I would say is that I've experienced a change, even since the election, and I would thank the people of Manitoba for giving me this opportunity. So one of the things that I used to talk about in the Indigenous context is that reconciliation is about bringing Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together. But often the reconciliation that we seek in the Indigenous community is a reconciliation within the own generations of our family. And now what I can say after the experience of talking to people, I don't want to name drop, but like some very well-known Manitobans, some very just average, grassroots Manitobans, is I think that that's true of everyone in the province. You could be a Mennonite person, a Jewish person, somebody whose family has been here for generations, somebody who's perhaps just arrived. And I think there's a sense of optimism, but also a sense that you want in your time here on earth to be able to make good on the people who matter to you, mom and dad, your kids, your friends, your relatives, and things like that. And so if we, in this moment, can help shine a light on the importance of strengthening the ties that bind, then that's a pretty awesome opportunity for us to deliver on. And what I would say to the people of Manitoba is thank you for encouraging me to see beyond the bounds of my own community and to recognize that I'm part of this province along with everyone else.
Premier Wap Kinew, thank you very much for your time. And I'm going to book you in for another 6 weeks. That's right. Yeah.
For fourth appearance.
That's right. Well, yeah, fourth, you get the,
you get a t-shirt. You get a t-shirt on the fourth one. And it's a picture of us.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, good Lord. No, thanks very much for your time. This is like will be among the busiest weeks you ever have in office. So we appreciate you making time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me back, and let's go for round 4 on the podcast.
Yeah, that's right.